Good afternoon. Welcome to your Year 4 IPC lesson, the first one of the week, and indeed the first proper talk session of this unit. We are moving in, as I'm sure you're all aware, into our topic of ancient Egypt. And hopefully last week you will have come up with your knowledge harvest, some of the things that you already know about Egypt, and some of the things that you'd like to know about Egypt. And we'll be asking you for some of those ideas at one of our Teams meetings in the next couple of weeks. This afternoon and tomorrow, what we're going to be looking at doing is creating a fact file or a poster about farmers and the River Nile in general, because they kind of go hand in hand together. The farmers wouldn't have existed without the River Nile, and we'll talk about that this afternoon. First of all, though, where in the world is Egypt, and which continent is it on? So is it on Europe, Asia, North America, South America, Africa, Oceania, or Antarctica? And which part of that continent is Egypt in? Okay, so press pause now, have a little think about it, talk with a partner if you're in school, talk with an adult if you're at home. When you're ready, press play. So press pause now. Okay, so Egypt itself is on the continent of Africa, okay, one of the largest continents. It's in northern Africa. It's in the top part of Africa. You can see Egypt here. I'm circling it with the cursor. Now, North Africa is predominantly made up of what we call the African Arabic wing. Okay, there are all these countries here. So we've got Sudan, Egypt, Libya, we've got Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. All of those countries are Arabic speaking countries. Okay, but they are in the African Arabic wing because they're on the continent of Africa. On this side, you've got the Asian Arabic wing. That includes Saudi Arabia, Yemen, you've got Kuwait, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, all of those sorts of countries on this side. Okay, but they are on the Asian continent. Okay, so just asking one of these questions here at the bottom here, why isn't Saudi Arabia one of the African Arabic countries? Bearing in mind, this is where Saudi Arabia is. Press pause now, have a think about it, and then come back to me. Okay, well, Saudi Arabia, as I've already mentioned, is in Asia. Therefore, it cannot be one of the African Arabic countries. Okay, it's on a different continent, a different landmass. One common thread, one important thing that will be running all the way through our ancient Egypt topic is that of the big river, the great river that flows through Egypt. I'm going to press pause now. What I want you to do is just talk to either a partner or an adult at home. Do you know the name of the river that flows through Egypt? Press pause now. Okay, welcome back. Well, hopefully most of you will know that the River Nile is the river that runs through Egypt. Without the River Nile, ancient Egypt wouldn't have been as important as it was in the world, and the country itself wouldn't be there in quite the same way as it is today. The Nile actually starts off as two smaller rivers, but both parts are up in the mountains. Okay, certainly the highlands of Ethiopia are very high, and the River Nile, the Blue Nile and the White Nile, as they're called, they come together in a place called Sudan at Khartoum. And then the River Nile will then wind its way into Egypt, where it is at its biggest, its widest. The river then will, just as it goes past Cairo, Cairo is the capital city where the big pyramids are, the Giza pyramids, it will then split into lots of smaller rivers that end up in the ocean. Okay, they end up in the ocean at Alexandria, which is named after Alexander the Great, and the sea that they end up in is the Mediterranean Sea. Now, this little area I told you the river splits into smaller rivers. That's what we call the Nile Delta, the delta. Okay, that's where a river splits into smaller rivers. I've just got a few questions here. I'm going to reveal on the screen shade. I'm going to ask you to press pause, and then I'm going to ask you to try and answer them with a partner or with an adult. So, what's the river called that flows through Egypt? Where does it enter the sea? And what's the sea called? Which countries does the Nile cross and how many of them? And then when the Nile splits into many smaller rivers as it gets near the sea, what do we call that? What part of the Nile do we call that? Press pause now, and then we'll come back together and you can carry on with the lesson. Don't forget, because we're on a video, you can always rewind the video just to hear me talk again if it will help you answer some of the questions. So press pause now. Okay, so we know that the river is called the River Nile. It enters the sea at Alexandria, Port Alexandria, and it enters into the Mediterranean Sea. It crosses lots of countries, but the main countries are Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt. There are the big countries that it winds its way through. And then the Nile splits into smaller rivers once it gets near the Mediterranean Sea, and we call that the Nile Delta. So hopefully you were able to answer some of those questions. As we move into learning about farming in Egypt, it's really important to know that ancient Egypt had only 3 seasons. How is this different to England? What I want you to do in a moment is press pause, and I want you to tell me what are the name of the seasons that we have in England and how many of them are there. I'll press pause now. Okay, so England, or the United Kingdom, has 4 main seasons: spring, summer, autumn, winter. There are 4 of them. So there is 1 more season in England to what there is in Egypt, or in ancient Egypt. The first season in ancient Egypt, or in Egypt, is called the Akhet, okay, and that usually happens between June and September. Now, this is what we call the inundation or the flooding. The Nile's water levels rise and the river bursts its banks, it floods the land. And what it does is it makes the land around the river really fertile for growing crops. It makes it really easy to grow crops. And you can see in the picture here, there's an old picture there of the old inundation of the Nile. Without this flooding, the land would be no good for growing food. And you can see this is very close to the pyramids in Cairo. So this is the Akhet. I thought it would be interesting to look at this satellite picture of the River Nile working its way through Egypt. You can see that most of the land in Egypt is desert. It's very dry, very hot. Nothing can grow there easily. But you can see in and around the River Nile, it's very green, okay? Right up to the Nile Delta at the top there. Now, this is because of the inundation, the flooding. Without that flooding, the Nile would not be good for farmers to grow crops. All because of the inundation, the flooding. Okay, the second season for growing crops in ancient Egypt is that of the Peret. Now, this is the growing season. Farmers planted their crops all along the banks of the River Nile where it had been flooded. The crops grown were cereals. Okay, we all know about cereal. Pulses, things like lentils and beans were grown, and flax. Now, flax is needed for when you are making cotton, and Egypt has been for many, many centuries famous for its cotton, Egyptian cotton. All this happens because of the River Nile. But how did the farmer use the Nile water to keep their crops healthy? Because it's all very well having the land flooded once a year, but the rest of the year it's really hot in Egypt. They would have needed to have watered their crops, their plants. So what happened? They dug what we call mini canals, what we call irrigation canals from the main river. Okay, and then that would have flowed all the way to their land. And then they used something called a shadoof to water their crops. A shadoof really is a big long stick with a bucket on the end. And what they used to do was lift up the bucket and then swing it around to their crops and then water them. That shadoof was very simple, but very useful. Without it, the farmers would have found it really difficult to water their crops. The final season is called the Shemu. Okay, the Shemu is between March and May, and this is the harvesting season. This is when the crops are harvested, stored, and sold. All of this would have been impossible without the flooding of the Nile, the inundation of the Nile. Without that happening, nothing would grow in Egypt very easily. And compared to England, their seasons are very different. Our harvest season is at the end of summer, in and around August, September time. For the Egyptians, it's between March and May, before it got too hot in the summer and their crops would be destroyed. So different places in the world have different harvesting seasons. Okay, so let's move on to the independent task. Now, this is something that you can work on for the next two or parts of the next 2 afternoons. And we want you to create an information poster about the River Nile and farming. You can use this video to help you with some of the names and some of the ideas. You can also use the internet at home or in school to add some information of your own. When you're finished with your posters, and we do want you to take some time and make it look really nice, we would love to see some of these. So why not take a picture and either email it to us at my school email address or our school email addresses, or you could always upload it to Teams if you wanted to. And then we'll show them on the year group pages so that everybody can enjoy them. Okay, so I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Take care. Bye-bye.